All right, everyone, welcome back for CES Deep Dive number 20. We're going to be focusing on the Australian domestic airline industry today.
Yeah, should be pretty interesting.
Definitely, we've got this fascinating report chock full of data and insights. Kind of gives us a snapshot of where things stand with passenger numbers, airline competition, those fun airfares,
Mm-hmm.
and even take a look back at how things have evolved since deregulation back in 1990.
Right, it's come a long way.
So let's jump right in. The report leads off with this big picture view and, demand for domestic flights. It's really booming. Virgin Australia and Jetstar, they both actually hit record passenger numbers just this past December.
Yeah, it's great to see that travel is back in a big way, but all this growth, it comes with some challenges. Airlines are really struggling to keep up with the demand.
Right, and that capacity crunch, it's partly because of those aircraft delivery delays, Boeing and Airbus. It seems like they're always in the news for that these days.
It's definitely a factor.
And, think about those recent flights you've been on. I mean, packed, right?
Oh, absolutely.
That's a direct result of this capacity squeeze. And it's not just about being crammed in like sardines. It really makes it harder for airlines to handle any kind of disruption.
Right. Think of it like this. When airlines are operating with these high load factors, basically how full their planes are,
Yeah.
they're much more vulnerable to disruptions. It's like, imagine a bathtub that's filled to the brim, right? Even a tiny little splash, it's going to overflow.
Oh, yeah, good analogy.
Airlines, they're in a similar boat. Even the smallest hiccup, it can trigger this cascade of delays and cancellations.
Makes sense. Now, here's something that really jumped out at me in the report. Remember Rex and Bonza, those newer airlines trying to shake things up a bit?
Yeah, I do.
Well, they both pulled out of those major city routes last year in 2024.
Yeah, and that move really raises questions about how connected different parts of Australia are by air, especially for folks in regional areas who, relied on those airlines. What does it mean for competition? We're essentially seeing a duopoly emerging here with Qantas Group and Virgin Australia.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Of course, we can't talk about airlines without talking about, well, airfares.
Of course not. Everyone wants to know about the price tag.
Exactly. So the report shows that after this noticeable jump in October and November, fares did stabilize in December.
That's some good news for travelers, at least, but it's important to remember that fares are still higher than they were before COVID, particularly on those popular routes between major cities.
Right, and here's a little tidbit from the report. While those average fares did go down, the prices of those discount tickets, they actually shot up in December.
Classic case of supply and demand, especially during the holidays.
Yeah, airlines definitely know when people are eager to travel, and they price accordingly. But, air travel, it's not just about price. It's also about reliability.
Absolutely. It's about getting to your destination on time and without any hiccups.
Exactly. And the report paints a bit of a mixed picture when it comes to flight cancellations and delays. The good news is cancellation rates have improved,
Mm-hmm.
but the industry as a whole is still struggling to get those flights departing and arriving on time. On-time performance is still lagging behind the long-term average.
Yeah, and if we look at the data, Virgin Australia has made some big strides in reducing cancellations. They actually had very low rate in December.
That's great for people flying with them, but let's be honest, who hasn't experienced that frustration of a delayed flight?
I know I have.
It really throws a wrench in your travel plans.
It does, and the report confirms that those on-time arrival rates, they definitely need some attention across the board.
All right, let's shift gears a bit and look at what the Australian government is doing to support those regional aviation services, especially with, Rex's financial struggles.
Right. So the government, they stepped in to acquire some of Rex's debt. They basically wanted to prevent the collapse of those really crucial regional air services.
It's essential for those communities.
Absolutely.
And it seems they're not stopping there. The report mentions some pretty interesting reforms to Sydney Airport's slot management scheme, trying to make things fairer and more transparent.
Yeah, the goal there is to make sure that airlines aren't hoarding slots they don't intend to use. That can limit options for other airlines and potentially drive up prices.
Right. And they're also working on a new aviation customer rights charter, which is currently open for public comment. All of this, it's part of a bigger effort to improve the passenger experience.
For sure.
So it's pretty clear that the Australian airline industry is in a state of flux right now. You've got this surge in demand, but they're also juggling these competition and reliability issues.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like the government is taking an active role in trying to, smooth out some of the turbulence.
Definitely.
So much going on.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
But we've only just scratched the surface.
There's more to come.
We'll be back in a moment to continue our deep dive into the Australian domestic airline industry.
This report, it actually takes us back in time a bit, compares the industry today to what it was like before deregulation.
Oh, cool, like a history lesson.
Sort of. So before 1990, picture this, just two airlines calling the shots in the domestic market.
Wow, just two.
Yeah, Trans-Australia Airlines, or TAA, it was government-owned, and then you had Ansett Airlines, which was privately owned. That was it.
That's wild. I mean, today we've got, what, like a handful at least, all vying for passengers.
Exactly. Back then, air travel, it was a luxury for a lot of Australians. The population was smaller, and the industry, it was heavily regulated.
Makes sense. Fewer people flying probably meant fewer flights. And with just those two big players, airfares must have been sky high, right?
You're on the right track. Then deregulation hit in 1990, and boom, everything changed. It was like someone threw open the doors and said, come on in.
I bet that shook things up.
Totally. New airlines popped up left and right. You had Compass, Virgin Blue, Rex, all eager to grab a piece of the market.
So that's when those low-cost carriers really took off in Australia.
You got it. Suddenly, flying became more affordable, more accessible. It brought in a whole new wave of travelers.
I bet that was a game changer.
Oh, yeah. The report actually highlights that shift. In December 24, the best discount fares, they were way lower than back in December 94, even when you adjust for inflation.
Wow, that's a pretty big difference. Sounds like deregulation had a pretty positive impact overall.
It did, but, like with any major change, there were some bumps along the way. More airlines also meant some consolidation on certain domestic routes.
Oh, so fewer options for some travelers.
Yeah, especially those connecting those smaller towns and cities. It was a trade-off, you could say. More competition, lower fares, but maybe fewer choices on some routes.
I see. It's a balancing act.
It is, but the competition, it didn't fade away. In the early 2010s, we saw this other wave of intense competition. Virgin Blue, they rebranded as Virgin Australia, ready to go head-to-head with Qantas for those, business travelers.
A real battle for the skies.
You could say that. They got into this capacity war, adding more flights, slashing fares, all to win over customers.
Sounds like passengers were the winners there.
For a while, they were, but all that aggression, it led to, financial losses for both airlines.
I can imagine.
Things settled down a bit by the mid-2010s. That rivalry cooled off.
So fares probably stabilized too.
Yeah, but unfortunately, around the same time, service reliability started to slip.
Uh-oh.
Cancellation rates climbed, on-time performance dipped, and it's a trend that's, continued in recent years.
Finding that sweet spot between affordability, competition, and reliability, it sounds like an ongoing challenge.
For sure, it's a complex industry, lots of moving parts. Airlines, they're dealing with fuel costs, air traffic control delays, and then, of course, there was the whole COVID-19 pandemic, which basically brought everything to a standstill in 2020.
Right, almost forgot about that. That was a huge disruption for everyone.
Absolutely. Border closures, canceled flights, airlines were really struggling financially. It's pretty remarkable that they made it through.
It is. They showed some real resilience.
They did, and, government support helped too. Virgin Australia, they went through this major restructuring, came out with a new focus on those value-conscious travelers.
Right, and Rex, they saw an opportunity to expand into those major city routes, right? Kind of capitalize on the changing market.
That's right, but that gamble, it didn't really pay off. And then you had Bonza entering the scene in 2023, targeting those regional travelers, offering flights to those holiday spots.
Interesting.
A lot of those routes, they had been unserved before. For a bit, it seemed like competition was heating up again.
I see.
But then, as we know, both Bonza and Rex pulled out of those major city routes last year, leaving us with, the Qantas Group and Virgin Australia.
Back to a duopoly, huh?
Sort of. This report really shows an industry that's always changing, adapting to everything from the economy to technology and even global events. It's dynamic, that's for sure, and it'll be interesting to see what happens next, especially with the government focusing on those regional services and passenger rights.
Definitely. Speaking of fascinating, there's one big piece we haven't talked about yet. Jet fuel prices.
Ah, yes, jet fuel, a major expense for airlines. And those prices, they can be volatile, which really affects airfares.
Right, so let's break it down. The report says jet fuel usually makes up, like 15 to 25% of an airline's operating costs?
That's a big chunk of their budget, for sure. And those costs, they can fluctuate like crazy. Depends on global supply demand, world events. It's a complicated market.
So the report shows that jet fuel prices, they've been trending down since September 2023. But lately, they've started creeping back up again.
That's something to watch, for sure. The report mentions the lower Aussie dollar against the U.S. dollar as a factor.
So a weaker Aussie dollar equals pricier fuel for our airlines. Sounds like that could push airfares up.
It's definitely a possibility. But, airlines often use hedging strategies to try to lessen the impact of those fuel price swings. They're basically locking in a price for future fuel, which gives them some stability.
Smart move. But even with that, those rising fuel costs are probably squeezing airline profits, right?
Most likely. And that pressure could trickle down to passengers. We might see higher airfares because of it. It's a balancing act for airlines, managing those costs and staying competitive.
Makes you wonder how they'll adapt to these rising fuel costs in the long term. Will we see them switch to more fuel-efficient planes, maybe even start exploring alternative fuels?
Those are some good possibilities. The need to adapt, it could lead to some real innovation in the industry.
And speaking of changes, the report also talks about international travel trends and airline alliances.
Oh, yeah, international travel is making a comeback. Passenger numbers are climbing steadily. The report even mentions more flight services from airlines like South African Airways, China Southern, American, and Delta.
The world is on the move again. What about those airline alliances? I think the report mentioned something about the ACCC and Virgin Australia and Qatar Airways.
Right, the ACCC granted them interim authorization. Basically, it allows Virgin Australia and Qatar Airways to work together on marketing and selling flights between Doha and a bunch of Australian cities: Brisbane, Melbourne, Perth, and Sydney.
So they're teaming up, offering more options for travelers.
Exactly. It's good for both airlines. They get to tap into each other's networks and customer bases.
But didn't the ACCC usually watch collaborations like this pretty closely, especially when it comes to competition?
They do, but in this case, Virgin Australia and Qatar Airways made a commitment to protect passengers if they don't get that final regulatory approval.
Makes sense. Seems like a lot is happening on the international travel side of things.
It is. It's a good reminder that the Australian airline industry, it's all connected to this global network. What happens around the world affects us here.
And those global forces, they can impact domestic air travel too.
Absolutely. What happens on one side of the world can ripple over to the other side.
Speaking of impacts, let's talk about something that affects every traveler. Every single one. Customer service.
It's an area where, there's always room for improvement. The report actually highlights some interesting stuff happening. Like the government, they're rolling out this new aviation industry ombudsman scheme, along with an airline customer rights charter.
Oh, okay, sounds promising. So what exactly will this charter do for passengers?
Well, it spells out those passenger rights, things like the right to be treated with dignity and respect, the right to get accurate and timely information,
Right.
and importantly, the right to fair remedies and support if your flight gets canceled or delayed, during those disruptions.
Makes sense. So it's all about making the travel experience, smoother, fairer for everyone.
Exactly. And it really puts a big focus on accessibility and inclusivity, which is so important for all travelers.
Now, what about those flight cancellations and delays? Those are always a pain. Does the charter address, like, compensation in those situations?
That's a great question. It's something the ACCC is pushing for. They believe the charter should lay out like specific compensation amounts for different scenarios,
Okay,
just to make things more clear and consistent for passengers.
that makes sense. Knowing your rights and what to expect, it would definitely take some of the stress out of those travel disruptions.
For sure. And it would also, encourage airlines to be more proactive, offer reasonable solutions, so maybe fewer complaints would have to go all the way to that ombudsman scheme.
Sounds like a win-win both for passengers and airlines.
I think so. Speaking of complaints, the report also mentions some legal action from the ACCC against WebJet.
WebJet, the online travel booking site.
That's the one. The ACCC is alleging that they made, well, some false and misleading statements to customers about flight prices and bookings.
That doesn't sound good.
No, it doesn't. They're accused of leaving out those compulsory fees from their advertised prices and, get this, confirming bookings when the flights hadn't even been secured with the airline.
Oh, wow, that's concerning.
It is. The ACCC is going after them for penalties, injunctions, and consumer redress. It'll be interesting to see what happens. It's a good reminder that even when you're booking online, it's important to, do your research and be careful.
Absolutely. Speaking of research, wasn't there something in the report about changes at Sydney Airport?
Yeah, you're right. The government's making some reforms to how they oversee those takeoff and landing slots at Sydney Airport. They want to make things more transparent and fair when it comes to how those slots are allocated and used.
So they're basically trying to prevent airlines from, like, holding on to slots they don't plan to use, which, limits options for other airlines and could drive up prices.
Exactly. The reforms even include penalties for misusing slots, to encourage airlines to be more responsible.
Hopefully that'll lead to, the airport using its capacity more efficiently, fewer delays, a better travel experience for everyone.
That's the goal. It's great to see the government stepping in, addressing these issues, trying to make things better for both airlines and passengers.
Well, this deep dive has been quite the journey through the Australian domestic airline industry. We've talked about everything from, like, record passenger numbers and airline competition to the impact of jet fuel prices, service reliability, the government's role in shaking things.
It's a complex system, that's for sure. It's constantly changing, responding to everything from global economic trends to technology and government policies.
And even though there are definitely challenges ahead, there are also these efforts to make the industry, more competitive, more reliable, more customer-focused.
Absolutely.
It'll be really interesting to see how things play out in the next few years.
It will.
So as we wrap things up here, I encourage everyone to keep exploring this industry. It's fascinating. Stay curious, keep asking questions, and be sure to join us again for our next deep dive into the world of aviation.
We'll see you then.
Thanks for listening.